There is a particular stillness that settles over an empty stadium when the crowd has gone. The roar of tens of thousands of fans fades into echoes, leaving nothing but the rhythm of your own heartbeat and the soft hum of fluorescent lights above. In that quiet, every detail is sharper, every sound amplified, every memory more vivid. It is in that silence that the true cost of the game becomes apparent. The cheers and adulation do not travel with the players to the locker room. They do not cushion the blows. They do not steady the grip on a helmet. They do not mend a shoulder that has been twisted in a fraction of a second. The aftermath of the game is not measured in highlights or stats. It is measured in the lingering weight of what has been lost and what has been changed. I have walked through those empty corridors, listened to the echoes of past victories and defeats, and considered the men who left the field on one day and never returned to the same version of themselves. The term final season takes on a haunting gravity in this space. It is not merely the last season a player competes. It is the season in which something irreparable occurs. Something invisible. Something that cannot be blamed on a single collision or an obvious injury. For some, it is a subtle betrayal from the tools they trust. A betrayal that quietly erodes skill, confidence, and ultimately, identity. That is the story that has remained largely hidden. That is the story of the equipment tampering scandal in the National Football League. In the early months, the anomalies were nearly imperceptible. A veteran quarterback noticed his passes slipping from his fingers more than usual. He trained relentlessly. Hours of repetition honed into muscle memory. Yet the ball no longer seemed to respond in the way he expected. At first, he assumed fatigue, mental distraction, a minor setback in form. But patterns emerged. Receivers began to miss passes they would have normally caught. Linebackers found their tackles were less effective, pads offering inconsistent protection against the force of collision. Players started to whisper, noticing subtle shifts in the way helmets felt, how gloves gripped the ball, even how shoulder pads distributed force. These were not dramatic alterations, not failures that would trigger immediate alarm. They were microscopic, deliberate, and insidious. The human body is a finely calibrated instrument, a machine of reflexes and instinct. For professional athletes, the smallest change in grip, balance, or resistance can mean the difference between a perfect throw and an intercepted pass, a clean tackle and a concussion. Equipment is not merely an extension of a player's body. It is part of their identity, part of the trust they place in a game governed by rules and fairness. To tamper with that trust is to tamper with the game itself. I recall conversations with players who were too afraid to speak publicly at the time. One lineman described feeling a cold unease every time he stepped onto the field, a vague sense that something had shifted, but that he could not name it. He said the shoulder pads felt different, just enough to throw off his timing, just enough to make a difference in the collisions that define the line of scrimmage. He never stopped playing, but when asked about that season years later, his eyes darkened. It was not the same game, he said. I was not the same player. That is the invisible wound, the mark left by tampered equipment. The league itself was not immediately aware. Or perhaps it did not want to be. Investigations into equipment have always been opaque, and the supply chains for gloves, helmets, and padding are vast and complex. Vendors, manufacturers, and team equipment managers intersect in ways that make accountability difficult to trace. And yet, the evidence was there. Performance metrics showed anomalies beyond the expected statistical variance. Injury reports reflected impacts in ways that raised questions about consistency and safety. Coaches noticed patterns, subtle declines in performance in some games that could not be fully explained by strategy or opposition. What began as whispers turned into suspicions, and suspicions turned into investigations. I have examined the data. I have spoken to engineers who study the biomechanics of football equipment, and to doctors who understand the ways in which minor variations can have catastrophic consequences on a player's body. Gloves treated with chemicals that reduce grip, pads with uneven or compressed cushioning, Helmets with inconsistent padding all create a landscape of risk that is both invisible and immediate. A quarterback's accuracy, a linebacker's tackle, a receiver's catch, they are all dependent on trust in these instruments. When that trust is compromised, so too is the body, the mind, and the spirit. The stories are as varied as they are haunting. A wide receiver who had relied on a particular pair of gloves for years suddenly began dropping passes in the championship stretch. A defensive end reported a strange pressure distribution in his helmet that coincided with minor concussions accumulating over the season. None of these incidents individually would have warranted attention. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. It was a subtle sabotage that altered outcomes, careers, and trust. And yet, the human element remains. These are not just statistics or anomalies. They are people. Men who dedicated their lives to a game, whose bodies were instruments honed over decades of practice, who expected that the league, the teams, and the equipment they relied upon would honor the implicit covenant of safety and fairness. That covenant was broken. Some players walked away silently, disillusioned and bruised in ways that could not be seen on the field. Others took the risk to speak, risking careers, reputations, and relationships to shine a light on a hidden truth. When the scandal became public, the headlines screamed. Tampering, scandal, betrayal, but the real story, the human cost, the unseen injuries, the quiet moments of fear and doubt in locker rooms remained largely untold. This documentary seeks to tell that story. It follows the players who experienced the betrayal, the staff who observed it, and the officials who scrambled to maintain order in the face of revelations that challenged the very integrity of the game. I want you to imagine being on that field, gripping a football that suddenly does not respond the way it should. Imagine trusting that your helmet will protect you, only to discover subtle variations that compromise its integrity. Imagine realizing that the tools meant to safeguard your career could betray you without warning. The psychological impact is profound. Confidence falters. Decision-making is clouded. Reflexes hesitate. And in a sport measured in milliseconds and inches, hesitation is devastating. This scandal exposed more than tampered equipment. It revealed systemic vulnerabilities in a league that is both immensely powerful and deeply reliant on trust. It raised questions about accountability, oversight, and the limits of regulation. It forced the league, players, and the public to confront uncomfortable truths about what it means to compete fairly and safely in the highest levels of sport. It is impossible to quantify the full toll. Careers were altered. Health was compromised. Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. Some of the players affected still carry the memory of that season. A reminder that even in a game defined by glory and spectacle, there is a dark side. A side where ambition, greed, and secrecy intersect in ways that are almost imperceptible until the consequences are undeniable. And yet, there is also resilience. Whistleblowers came forward. Investigations forced accountability. Equipment standards were revised. Oversight improved. But the story does not end with regulation. It is a story of human vulnerability, of the delicate balance between trust and betrayal, between performance and protection. It is a story that remains a warning for generations to come. Tonight, we enter that world. We examine the season when trust was broken. We hear from those who lived it. We trace the chain from locker room to manufacturer to league office. And we confront the question that lies at the heart of every great sport. What happens when the very instruments of the game become instruments of harm? The silence of the empty stadium echoes with memory, loss, and reflection. It is a stillness that carries lessons not only for players, but for every person who believes in fairness, integrity, and the human cost of ambition. That is the story we are about to tell. That is the untold side of the game. That is the dark side of football. To understand the depths of the equipment tampering scandal, we must first understand the history and culture of the game itself. The National Football League has always been a sport of extremes, a contest of strength, strategy, and endurance. But it is also a game of precision, where trust in the tools of the trade is as essential as trust in teammates. From the earliest days of leather helmets and rudimentary padding to the high-tech gear of today, equipment has not merely protected players. It has defined the boundaries between safety and vulnerability, between performance and injury. Players train for years to perfect their physicality, their instincts, and their timing, but the instruments they rely on must be reliable. That trust is assumed, almost sacred, and it is that very trust that was violated. The culture of equipment in the NFL is deeply ingrained. Players understand that their helmets, gloves, and pads are not simply accessories. They are extensions of the body, interfaces between human skill and the unforgiving physicality of the game. Coaches and trainers reinforce that awareness every day. The slightest deviation in padding, grip, or weight can mean the difference between a successful play and a catastrophic injury. Over the decades, equipment regulations have evolved to mitigate risk, to protect the human body as much as possible without altering the essence of competition. Safety and performance are always in tension. Players push boundaries of endurance and skill, while equipment is expected to meet the exacting demands placed upon it. Yet, the league's history has never been free of controversy. There have been incidents in which equipment was manipulated to gain a competitive edge. In the 1960s, reports surfaced of illegal shoe modifications to enhance traction on wet fields. In later decades, discussions arose around altered gloves or worn padding that gave certain teams advantages in critical moments. These were often dismissed as minor infractions, anomalies in an otherwise tightly regulated system. But the equipment tampering scandal of recent years revealed something different. It was not incidental. It was deliberate, systematic, and widespread, challenging the very principles upon which the game was built. The scandal centered on subtle modifications that were almost imperceptible but had profound impacts on player performance. Helmets with inconsistent padding, gloves treated with chemical agents to reduce grip, shoulder pads that altered force distribution. These changes were not obvious to the casual observer or even to the players themselves at first. They were designed to be just different enough to affect the outcome without triggering immediate suspicion. The human cost was significant. Players reported unexpected injuries, loss of confidence, and unexplained declines in performance. Careers were altered, and for some, the season in which these alterations occurred became their final season at peak performance. One quarterback described the experience in stark terms. He said that during practices he could not understand why throws he had executed perfectly for years suddenly became unreliable. The ball seemed to slip at the critical moment, the texture unfamiliar, the timing disrupted. I felt betrayed by the game itself, he said. It was not just my body. It was the equipment. It was everything I had trusted for years. His testimony illustrates the intersection of physical skill and psychological confidence, and how a breach in the tools of the game can erode both. Doctors and sports scientists confirmed that even minor alterations in equipment can have cascading effects. Helmets that are fractionally misaligned can increase the risk of concussions. Gloves with altered surfaces affect grip strength and control. For players, the implications are profound. The trust placed in equipment is intimate and non-negotiable. Every snap, every pass, every tackle relies on predictable performance. When that trust is violated, the consequences extend beyond a single game. Confidence falters, timing is disrupted, and hesitation can increase the risk of injury. Some players reported that the mental strain of uncertainty, wondering whether their gloves or helmets were their decision-making on the field. Football is a game measured in milliseconds and inches. Any disruption can be decisive, and when that disruption is manufactured, the psychological toll is as real as the physical. The human dimension of the scandal cannot be overstated. Stories emerged from veterans who had relied on decades of routine, only to find that equipment subtly altered their performance. Rookies who trusted guidance from experienced players suddenly faced unexplained failures. Trainers and equipment managers were caught between loyalty to players and compliance with teams. Whistleblowers stepped forward, often risking careers, to illuminate the scale and intent behind the tampering. These personal accounts reveal a culture of fear, secrecy, and moral compromise. From a broader perspective, the scandal exposed systemic weaknesses. Oversight procedures, supplier audits, and internal reporting structures failed to detect or prevent the tampering. The league was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how much control it cedes to manufacturers, how thoroughly equipment is monitored, and how quickly players, coaches, and staff can identify subtle manipulations. In a game defined by precision, even a small failure in governance can have outsized effects. The scandal also highlighted the intersection of business and ethics. Equipment manufacturers operate in a highly competitive environment, incentivized to innovate while adhering to league standards. Teams seek every advantage available, often pushing the limits of permissible modifications. The system depends on trust, verification, and transparency. But the tampering scandal revealed how fragile that system can be when oversight is incomplete, or when profit and ambition intersect with human vulnerability. For the public and the fans, the revelations challenge the perception of football as a purely merit-based contest. Spectators assume that what unfolds on the field reflects skill, strategy, and effort. The tampering scandal introduced a hidden variable, one that undermined the fairness of competition. Games won or lost under the influence of altered equipment carry a shadow. And players who endured the effects bear scars that statistics alone cannot convey. The investigative work behind uncovering this scandal relied on cross-disciplinary expertise. Engineers, medical professionals, statisticians, and journalists collaborated to identify patterns and quantify deviations. Their analyses confirmed that the anomalies were not accidental. They were deliberate, coordinated, and significant enough to compromise performance and safety. The findings prompted the league to revise standards, improve verification, and impose stricter oversight. Yet the human impact cannot be undone. Careers altered, confidence shaken, bodies compromised. These are consequences that persist beyond policy changes or procedural reforms. In reflecting on this scandal, it becomes clear that it is as much a story about human trust as it is about sports. Players entrust their lives to the game, to their teammates, and to the equipment designed to protect them. When that trust is violated, the consequences ripple outward, affecting careers, health, and the integrity of the sport itself. The equipment tampering scandal is a case study in the fragility of trust and the consequences of systemic oversight failure. As we move deeper into this story, we will examine the players affected, the mechanics of the tampering, the responses from teams and league officials, and the broader implications for ethics and accountability in professional sports. We will hear directly from those who experienced it, those who uncovered it, and those who were forced to reckon with its impact. This documentary seeks not only to inform, but to immerse the viewer in the reality of what it means to compete in a league where even the tools of the trade are no longer beyond question. The first signs were subtle, almost imperceptible. A veteran quarterback noticed it during a routine practice early in the season. The ball felt slightly slicker than usual, and yet it was the same brand, the same model, the same gloves he had relied upon for years. At first, he dismissed it, blaming fatigue or a momentary lapse in focus. He trusted his instincts and his hands, as every player does, and assumed that the inconsistency would pass. But it did not. Week after week, throws that should have been routine slipped away. Timing faltered, and the rhythm of the offense began to stutter. He was not alone. Across the league, small discrepancies began to emerge. Receivers dropped passes they would normally catch without thinking. Linemen found their blocks less effective, their protective padding somehow uneven in ways that defied explanation. Coaches and analysts noticed anomalies in statistics that could not be accounted for by strategy or opposition alone. It began in isolated incidents. A linebacker reported that his shoulder pads felt compressed on one side, changing the way he distributed force during collisions. These were men at the peak of their physical capabilities, highly attuned to the nuances of their equipment, yet they were confronted with alterations they could not explain. Coaches observed inconsistencies on the field and initially attributed them to fatigue, mental lapses, or natural variation. Yet over time, the evidence mounted. Performance deviations were consistent, reproducible, and concentrated in specific pieces of equipment. Analysts began to identify correlation between player struggles and the gear they were issued. Teams that rotated equipment suppliers reported fewer anomalies, suggesting that the issue was not inherent to the player's skill, but linked to the tools they relied upon. The psychological impact on players was profound. Football is a game of instinct, reaction, and trust in teammates, trust in coaching, and above all, trust in one's own body and the equipment that extends it. When equipment behaves unpredictably, confidence falters. Quarterbacks hesitate for milliseconds that can decide a play. Receivers misjudge distances or timing. Linemen miscalculate force distribution. These moments, imperceptible to spectators, accumulate across a season to undermine performance and heighten the risk of injury. For some players, the season when anomalies first appeared became their final season at peak performance. The equipment had silently altered the trajectory of their careers. An offensive lineman described a sense of betrayal that emerged quietly over weeks. You rely on your pads to protect you, on your gloves to secure the ball. When those fail in ways you cannot see, you start questioning everything. Is it me? Is it the game? Or is it the equipment? That doubt eats away at you every snap. His words reveal the emotional dimension of this first stage of the scandal. It was not just a physical threat, it was a psychological one. The integrity of the game itself seemed in question. Medical staff also noticed trends that seemed unusual. Minor injuries, particularly strains and bruising in areas normally protected by equipment, were reported with increased frequency among certain players. Doctors documented these injuries meticulously, yet they could not immediately determine the cause. On the surface, the injuries appeared routine, but within the context of performance data and equipment logs, patterns emerged. Helmets with padding inconsistencies correlated with minor concussions. Gloves correlated with fumbles, and shoulder pads correlated with joint strain. The anomalies were subtle, yet cumulative, undermining player safety and contributing to the invisible toll that would define the scandal. The first signs of tampering were, in many ways, a test of the league's oversight mechanisms. Equipment managers responsible for the distribution and maintenance of gear had never encountered issues of this scale or subtlety. Teams initially dismissed early reports as coincidental or isolated. Yet, as players persisted in reporting concerns, patterns became impossible to ignore. Internal reviews revealed discrepancies in inventory and batch production. Items that were supposed to meet strict specifications deviated in ways consistent with player reports. For the first time, suspicion turned into investigation. Trust, once assumed, became conditional. Players began to inspect every item issued to them, cross-reference serial numbers, and compare equipment with teammates. Veterans who had relied on consistency for decades found themselves scrutinizing the very tools that had always provided reliability. Rookies, already navigating the pressures of professional football, were introduced to a world where equipment could no longer be taken for granted. The psychological burden compounded the physical challenges, creating a season in which performance was dictated as much by uncertainty as by skill. By mid-season, whispers had become discussions. Players, trainers, and analysts pieced together anecdotal evidence and performance anomalies. Some suspected simple manufacturing errors, while others feared deliberate manipulation. There were questions about who would benefit, who might be responsible, and how such changes could occur without detection. These questions set the stage for deeper investigation. A journey that would uncover both deliberate tampering and systemic weaknesses in oversight. The league faced a dilemma. On one hand, it had a duty to protect players and preserve the integrity of the game. On the other, it had to navigate public perception, internal politics, and contractual obligations with suppliers. Early investigations were cautious, limited in scope, and focused on technical audits of equipment. By the end of the season, the first signs of tampering had left a trail of altered performance, minor injuries, and growing unease. In reflection, the first signs of tampering reveal the intersection of human skill, trust, and vulnerability. It is in this context that we begin our examination of the equipment tampering scandal. From small anomalies noticed in locker rooms to data-driven analyses exposing widespread disruption, the story unfolds with both human and systemic dimensions. The first signs of tampering are not merely a technical curiosity. They are a window into the vulnerabilities of the league, the moral dilemmas faced by teams, and the human cost borne by players. They are the threshold into a deeper, more unsettling investigation that would challenge assumptions about fairness, safety, and the very nature of competition in professional football. The locker room has always been a place of ritual, of preparation, and of quiet focus. It is where players confront their physical and mental readiness before stepping onto a field that rewards precision and punishes hesitation. The chatter, the laughter, the sound of cleats scraping against concrete, the click of helmets being fastened, all contribute to an atmosphere of controlled tension. In that space, players are vulnerable in ways that spectators never witness. The body is exposed, the mind is concentrated, and trust in every aspect of the game becomes tangible. It was within this environment that the first real impact of the equipment tampering scandal began to manifest in human terms. Players noticed subtle changes in the fit and feel of gloves, helmets, and pads. A veteran cornerback described arriving at the locker room before a Monday night game and immediately sensing a difference in the gloves issued to him. It was nothing dramatic, just a slight slickness, a little less friction on the palms. I tried to shake it off, but I could feel it the instant I caught the ball. I felt a fraction slower, a little less sure of my grip. At first, he assumed the change was minor or the result of a new batch from the supplier. But as the week progressed, and during the game, he began dropping passes he would have routinely intercepted. Anxiety built on itself, a compounding effect of physical uncertainty and mental distraction. Rookies faced an entirely different challenge. They were entering a professional league where every snap, every movement, and every decision carried amplified consequences. They were trained to trust coaches, teammates, and their instincts. But the subtle anomalies in equipment introduced a variable they could not account for. One rookie receiver, who had earned a spot on the roster after a standout collegiate career, described the sensation of gloves that felt different than those used in training camp. I knew something was off, but I could not tell if it was me or the gear. I began overthinking every catch, every adjustment. It affected my timing and my confidence. Unlike veterans, who could rely on years of repetition and bodily memory to compensate, rookies were forced into a constant negotiation with uncertainty, each misstep reinforcing self-doubt. Veterans, meanwhile, approached the situation differently. Years of experience had honed their instincts and reflexes, yet even they were vulnerable to the subtle betrayals of equipment. A 10-year veteran offensive lineman recounted how his shoulder pads felt slightly compressed on one side, throwing off his balance during blocks. He recognized immediately that something was wrong and reported it to trainers, but there was no clear mechanism for addressing the issue. The sense of frustration was compounded by the inability to identify whether the anomaly was a manufacturing flaw or deliberate manipulation. The professional instinct to adapt and compensate collided with the fear that the tools designed to protect and enhance performance were no longer reliable. Performance anxiety intensified within this environment. The knowledge that equipment might fail or behave unpredictably transformed routine plays into tests of endurance, skill, and trust. Quarterbacks hesitated an instant longer before snapping the ball. Receivers miscalculated distances, unsure whether their gloves would hold the ball at the critical moment. Linemen readjusted constantly, compensating for shifts in padding that subtly altered the distribution of force. These micro-adjustments, repeated hundreds of times in a single game, created fatigue and heightened the risk of injury. Anxiety was not merely mental. It was embodied, physically affecting movement and reaction times. Trainers and equipment managers were caught in the middle of this uncertainty. They had long-standing relationships with players, understanding preferences and nuances that could influence performance. Yet even they were baffled by the patterns emerging. Minor inconsistencies in helmet fit, glove texture, or padding alignment seemed almost invisible, yet they were sufficient to degrade performance. Equipment logs indicated that all items met league specifications, yet players insisted otherwise. The resulting tension created an environment of suspicion and stress, where every item of gear was scrutinized and every anomaly questioned. The locker room became a space of quiet investigation. Players compared gloves, helmets, and pads with teammates, inspecting serial numbers, textures, and compressibility. They tested grips, flex, and alignment in private corners of the room. Conversations became measured, careful, because suspicion carried social weight. Reporting a perceived anomaly could make one seem paranoid, or worse, disrupt team cohesion. Yet the risk of ignoring it was far greater. Misplaced trust in altered equipment could compromise performance and safety. Emotional reflections from players illustrate the depth of impact. One veteran linebacker described sleepless nights, replaying every play in his mind, wondering whether a dropped tackle was due to human error or faulty equipment. The uncertainty created a pervasive sense of vulnerability, as if the foundation upon which years of training had been built was unstable. Another veteran receiver described walking into a locker room and feeling the same tension he had experienced early in his career after a severe injury. Only this time, the threat was invisible, subtle, and psychological, compounded by the awareness that he was not alone in sensing it. Team meetings, once focused purely on strategy and tactics, began including discussions about gear reliability. Coaches encouraged players to report anomalies, yet clarity was elusive. Equipment suppliers and team staff were unable to identify systemic causes, leaving players in a state of unresolved uncertainty. The tension grew as the season progressed. Small failures on the field reinforced doubt in the locker room, and the player's psychological burden became as significant as any physical challenge. Not all players experienced the anomalies in the same way. Position, style of play, and individual sensitivity to equipment variations influenced perception. Rookies often overestimated the impact of minor differences. Veterans recognized subtle deviations immediately, and those in high-contact positions felt the effects most acutely. The variation underscored the difficulty in distinguishing between perception and reality. Yet patterns emerged that confirmed a broader issue. Statistical analysis showed correlation between performance decline and specific batches of gloves, helmets, and pads. Injuries, too, were not uniformly distributed, aligning with gear discrepancies. The locker room became a laboratory of observation, where players documented, compared, and theorized in real time. Fear and uncertainty shaped interactions. Players hesitated to voice concerns publicly for fear of being dismissed or ridiculed. Whispered conversations and private testing became the norm. The shared understanding of vulnerability created bonds of quiet solidarity, yet also highlighted the isolation inherent in professional football. Each player faced the possibility that their body could be compromised, their performance diminished, and their career trajectory altered, all by something beyond their immediate control. The experiences inside the locker room during this early stage of the scandal reveal a convergence of human skill, trust, and fragility. Players rely on instinct, repetition, and muscle memory. When equipment is altered in subtle ways, those systems are disrupted. Confidence falters, hesitation grows, and performance suffers. The psychological strain compounds the physical challenge, creating a situation in which even seasoned athletes question their abilities and decisions. As these anomalies persisted, patterns became undeniable. Players and staff began connecting their experiences across teams and positions. The anomalies were not isolated or random. Specific gear batches, suppliers, and timelines pointed toward a coordinated breach of trust. The locker room, initially a private space for preparation, became the first arena in which the implications of the tampering scandal could be collectively recognized. Conversations shifted from speculation to concern, from concern to the realization that a deeper investigation was necessary. By the end of this period, the locker room had transformed from a sanctuary of focus into a space charged with uncertainty. Players were acutely aware that the reliability of their gear could no longer be assumed. Trust had been compromised, and with it, the psychological foundation of their performance. Veterans and rookies alike confronted the unsettling reality that the game they had trained to master could now betray them in the most intimate of ways. This period marked the transition from perception to investigation. Individual anomalies, once dismissed as minor, now pointed toward systemic vulnerabilities. The league faced a challenge that extended beyond performance statistics or isolated injuries. The stories emerging from locker rooms exposed a pattern of disruption, anxiety, and subtle sabotage, compelling teams, equipment managers, and investigators to confront a broader reality. The first tangible acknowledgement of tampering had arrived, and it would set the stage for uncovering the full scale of the scandal. The players, unwittingly, had become the first witnesses to a scandal that would reshape understanding of equipment, trust, and integrity in the NFL. Each element is engineered with precision, tested under extreme conditions, and regulated by the league to ensure both performance and safety. Yet the scandal revealed that even slight deviations in design or function can carry disproportionate consequences. Helmets, the most visible piece of protective gear, are deceptively complex. They are not simply shells. They are engineered structures designed to absorb impact, reduce acceleration forces on the brain, and minimize the risk of concussions. A veteran lineman described how a slightly compressed pad could alter leverage in blocking, reduce mobility, and increase strain on joints. Gloves, often dismissed by casual observers as mere accessories, play a pivotal role in ball handling. A minor adjustment to the material or treatment of the glove can alter grip strength by measurable percentages, enough to affect a crucial catch or pass. A slight chemical coating, a subtle change in stitching, or variation in the weave can make the difference between a successful catch and a dropped pass. Every touch of the ball is calibrated through countless repetitions and muscle memory. Equipment is tested through standardized protocols, including drop tests for helmets, impact simulations for pads, and grip measurements for gloves. Any deviation beyond tolerances is flagged and corrected. Yet in the tampering scandal, these systems were circumvented. Subtle manipulations were introduced in ways designed to bypass routine checks. Chemical treatments on gloves were imperceptible without laboratory analysis. Helmets were modified internally to slightly adjust foam density. Shoulder pads were compressed to create uneven force distribution. You feel it immediately in your muscles and in your mind. A lineman echoed similar sentiments about altered pads, scribing subtle shifts in leverage and balance that made routine blocking more exhausting and more prone to error. These are human responses, rooted in instinct and experience, yet amplified when equipment no longer functions predictably. Engineers and equipment managers involved in the investigation highlighted the precision required to maintain standards. For the tampering to succeed, modifications had to be subtle enough to evade detection, yet effective enough to produce measurable impacts on performance. This reveals a deliberate understanding of biomechanics, material science, and human physiology. It was not accidental or incidental. It was carefully calculated, which underscores the severity of the breach. The human cost extends beyond physical injury to the erosion of trust in one's abilities and in the fairness of the game itself. Microtraumas, joint strain, and the mental toll of uncertainty combine to create outcomes that persist beyond a single season. They highlight how equipment, often taken for granted, functions as a critical interface between the human body and the game. The analysis of gear reveals not just how the tampering was achieved, but why its effects were so profound. Equipment is not incidental. It is integral. Compromise it, and the game itself is compromised. This scientific perspective provides the foundation for understanding the deliberate intent behind the scandal. The moment the first formal investigation began, the league entered uncharted territory. Complaints from players and coaches had accumulated quietly over weeks, months in some cases, documented in notebooks, whispered conversations, and private meetings. At first, management treated the concerns as anecdotal, isolated, and perhaps exaggerated by the stress and intensity of the season. Players had a history of being dismissed when raising equipment or injury concerns. Yet, as reports multiplied and patterns emerged, the urgency became impossible to ignore. The question was no longer whether equipment anomalies were occurring, but whether they were deliberate, systematic, and consequential. The timeline of complaints illustrates the evolution from observation to official inquiry. Early in the season, a handful of players reported minor issues with gloves, pads, and helmets. Equipment managers inspected gear, verified inventory, and confirmed compliance with supplier specifications. No obvious fault was found. By mid-season, however, the volume of complaints had increased, and players' narratives began to converge. Quarterbacks described unexpectedly slick gloves. Linemen noted compressed padding, and receivers dropped passes in ways that defied prior performance trends. Coaches recorded these incidents, while analysts identified correlations in performance statistics. It became clear that the anomalies were not random. A formal investigation was unavoidable. Team management faced a delicate balance. They had to maintain player trust while protecting organizational reputation and contractual obligations with suppliers. Initial internal reviews were cautious. Equipment logs were audited, suppliers were questioned, and statistical analyses were conducted. Whistleblowers emerged quietly, often players who had noticed patterns first and feared retaliation if they spoke openly. Some handed over evidence to trusted coaches or team staff. Others confided in medical personnel who maintained a degree of confidentiality. The league, informed by team reports, assembled a task force combining investigators, engineers, and medical consultants to assess the claims. The challenges of proving tampering were immediate and complex. Equipment moves constantly between storage, transportation, and locker rooms. Chain of custody had to be meticulously documented, but in practice, it was easy for discrepancies to occur naturally. Every helmet, pad, and glove passed through multiple hands, each with legitimate reasons to adjust or inspect. Investigators needed to distinguish between ordinary maintenance and deliberate manipulation. Chemical analyses were required to detect invisible coatings on gloves. Precision instruments measured foam density in helmets, and compression testing was applied to pads. Each test had to be exacting, reproducible, and legally defensible. Even with growing evidence, denials from suppliers and team staff complicated the process. Many argued that deviations were manufacturing anomalies or the result of normal wear and tear. The burden of proof rested on the investigators, and the margin for error was minimal. Players, meanwhile, lived with the tension of being both witnesses and potential targets. Speaking out risked consequences ranging from diminished playing time to social ostracization within their team. Veteran players described a dilemma. Do they protect their careers by remaining silent? Or do they risk professional and personal consequences by raising concerns? One lineman described the fear of retaliation vividly. You feel it in your chest every time you bring it up. The last thing you want is to be labeled difficult or paranoid. But if you don't say anything, your body takes the hits. Your performance suffers, and no one knows why. This fear, grounded in experience, delayed public acknowledgement of the problem and allowed the tampering to persist longer than it might have otherwise. Whistleblowers played a pivotal role in moving the investigation forward. A rookie equipment assistant assigned to handle gloves and pads noticed subtle chemical coatings and deviations in stitching across multiple batches. He documented these irregularities, photographed gear, and alerted league investigators anonymously. Similarly, a veteran trainer noticed unusual foam compression in helmets that correlated with specific players reporting headaches or minor concussions. These contributions, while initially dismissed by some within management, became critical pieces of the puzzle. Their courage and persistence allowed the investigation to progress despite institutional resistance and the inherent complexity of proving deliberate manipulation. League officials faced public and internal pressures. The NFL had long emphasized the integrity of competition and player safety. Yet no precedent existed for a scandal of this subtlety and technical sophistication. Early press reports speculated on potential causes but lacked confirmation. The league had to navigate public perception, manage relationships with sponsors, and ensure that teams remained functional while investigative teams conducted examinations. Every step required careful documentation, from interviews with players and staff to laboratory analyses of equipment. Missteps could compromise credibility, while delays risked further exposure of manipulated gear. Evidence began to accumulate in unexpected ways. Laboratory tests revealed that certain batches of gloves had been treated with a nearly imperceptible coating that reduced friction. Helmets from specific production runs showed internal padding densities slightly different from the approved specifications. Shoulder pads were discovered to have compression inconsistencies that affected force distribution. The anomalies were precise, sophisticated, and targeted. Investigators realized they were confronting a deliberate effort to compromise equipment performance in ways subtle enough to avoid routine detection. This was no longer an issue of manufacturing error or isolated oversight. It was intentional, engineered to alter outcomes at the player level. The human dimension remained central. Players, already aware of performance fluctuations, began to see their suspicions confirmed. The quarterback, who had noticed slippery gloves, expressed relief and frustration simultaneously. You want to be right when you sense something is wrong, but being right doesn't fix the season or the injuries. It just proves that someone was playing with you, with your body. With the game itself, the emotional weight of validation was heavy, layered with anger, betrayal, and anxiety. This psychological component made the investigation as much about human impact as technical verification. Investigators faced another obstacle: the scale of distribution. Equipment was manufactured and distributed across multiple teams, suppliers, and regions. Determining the scope of tampering required tracing every piece of affected gear, identifying commonalities, and confirming intentional modification. Interviews with equipment managers, trainers, and players helped map the flow of gear, but inconsistencies in record-keeping slowed progress. Analysts created timelines that correlated player complaints with batch numbers and game outcomes. Slowly, the pattern became undeniable. Specific batches of gloves, helmets, and pads were consistently associated with performance issues, minor injuries, and player anxiety. The investigation revealed a complex network of accountability and responsibility. Teams, suppliers, and individual staff members had roles to play, whether through oversight, action, or negligence. Management faced scrutiny for failing to detect the manipulations earlier. Suppliers confronted allegations of deliberate tampering or insufficient quality control. Players' experiences became evidence, their subjective reports cross-referenced with objective measurements. Each element had to be corroborated, contextualized, and integrated into a coherent narrative that could withstand scrutiny, both within the league and in potential legal or public arenas. Fear of retaliation remained a constant undercurrent. Players expressed concern that speaking to investigators could affect contracts, endorsements, or professional relationships. Some who had raised concerns internally reported being marginalized or sidelined. Whistleblowers were particularly vulnerable, relying on confidentiality to provide accurate information without jeopardizing their positions. The social dynamics of professional football hierarchy, competition, and team culture intensified the challenge of uncovering deliberate tampering. Yet, despite these risks, persistence led to revelations that would ultimately expose the breadth and sophistication of the scheme. By the midpoint of the investigation, the league confronted evidence that shocked many officials. The tampering was not random or sporadic. It was coordinated, affecting multiple teams and targeting critical pieces of equipment. The sophistication suggested knowledge of biomechanics, material science, and player behavior. The implications were immediate. Player safety had been compromised. Game integrity had been undermined, and the league's oversight mechanisms had failed to detect deliberate interference. These discoveries compelled the league to escalate the investigation, broaden the scope, and prepare for public disclosure. Players and staff reflected on the unfolding revelations with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The quiet suspicions that had permeated locker rooms and practices were confirmed, yet the validation also underscored the depth of betrayal. The trust that players placed in equipment, in management, and in the league itself had been violated. The investigation, while necessary, also illuminated the human toll of tampering, from minor injuries to disrupted performance and fractured confidence. The stage was now set for the next chapter of the scandal. From initial reports and locker room observations, the formal investigation had revealed a pattern of deliberate interference, a technical and moral breach with consequences for players, teams, and the league. The discoveries that emerged would not only shape the immediate response, but also redefine protocols, accountability, and perceptions of fairness in professional football. The league confronted the reality that the equipment once assumed to be reliable had been weaponized, and the human cost was both immediate and profound. In the world of professional football, loyalty and silence have long been currencies as valuable as speed and strength. Players, coaches, and staff are trained to focus on the game, to trust one another, and to maintain discretion in the face of adversity. The locker room operates as a microcosm of this ethos, where confidence in each other and in the systems around them sustains performance. It was within this culture of trust and quiet endurance that whistleblowers first emerged, individuals willing to risk professional relationships, reputations, and careers to reveal a truth that the league had struggled to confront. The earliest whistleblowers were often young employees or lower-level staffers whose responsibilities included equipment management. They were trained in routine inspection and maintenance, aware of the standards each helmet, glove, and pad must meet. Over time, some began to notice inconsistencies that defied explanation. A rookie equipment assistant described how gloves in a single batch exhibited a subtle chemical treatment that reduced grip. I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, a manufacturing anomaly, but the pattern kept appearing. I knew it wasn't random, and I knew I had to report it. Even if it cost me my job, these individuals were thrust into a moral conflict, balancing personal security against the imperative to protect the players and the integrity of the game. Veteran players also became whistleblowers, though the stakes were higher. These were individuals whose careers and reputations had been built over years of performance, recognition, and endorsements. Speaking out risked not only ostracization from teammates and coaches, but also scrutiny from sponsors and fans. One offensive lineman, who had been a team captain for nearly a decade, recalled the decision to confront management with evidence of altered shoulder pads. It was terrifying. I knew that raising concerns could make me a target, could end my season, maybe even my career. But staying silent meant letting my teammates play at a disadvantage and exposing our bodies to unnecessary risk. The courage required to act in such circumstances cannot be overstated. The act of whistleblowing was both ethical and perilous. Anonymous testimonies quickly multiplied, painting a picture of systemic manipulation. Players described gloves treated with coatings that subtly reduced friction, helmets whose internal padding had been modified to shift force distribution, and shoulder pads that altered balance and leverage. Equipment managers spoke of noticing repeated anomalies across multiple teams. Trainers recounted minor injuries and performance irregularities that suddenly aligned with specific batches of gear. The consistency of these observations suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Each testimony reinforced the others, forming a network of evidence that investigators would later rely upon. The emotional toll on whistleblowers was profound. Many described feelings of isolation, anxiety, and guilt. They were aware that their actions could disrupt careers, fracture teams, and draw intense scrutiny. Some reported sleepless nights, replaying moments when altered equipment had put players at risk, knowing that silence would mean complicity. One assistant recalled walking past a locker room and seeing a young player drop a pass due to slick gloves. I felt responsible, even though I hadn't caused it directly. The knowledge that someone had manipulated the gear and that I had to choose between speaking out and staying safe was unbearable. This tension illustrates the human dimension of the scandal, where moral courage intersected with the pressures of professional sport. The league's initial response to whistleblower revelations was cautious and, in some cases, defensive. Early reports were met with denials from management and suppliers alike. Officials emphasized that equipment met specifications and that no systemic issues had been identified. Attempts were made to suppress information or to discredit sources, sometimes through internal channels, sometimes through formal statements. Whistleblowers faced both overt and subtle pressures, ranging from warnings about confidentiality breaches to implicit threats regarding career advancement. The institutional reaction was designed to maintain appearances while the investigation gained momentum. Yet, it inadvertently highlighted the severity of the situation. Despite these pressures, some whistleblowers persisted, providing detailed accounts and physical evidence to investigators. They photographed equipment, cataloged anomalies, and maintained records of communications that documented both the modifications and the responses of management. These actions were critical in transforming anecdotal concerns into verifiable evidence. Investigators emphasized the importance of this step, noting that without the courage of insiders, the tampering could have continued undetected far longer. The meticulous documentation and willingness to speak out laid the foundation for the League to confront what had been occurring in plain sight, but under layers of assumed trust. Anonymous sources provided insights into the emotional strain of revealing wrongdoing. A veteran defensive back explained that the decision to speak with investigators required a deliberate weighing of risk. You know you are stepping into uncharted territory. Speaking up could isolate you, could create enemies, could even affect your future with the League. But doing nothing is worse. You are knowingly letting something harmful continue, and you can see it on the field every week. These words capture the profound psychological burden carried by those who acted to expose the scandal, and they illuminate the stakes beyond mere professional risk. There was a moral imperative intertwined with personal jeopardy. As stories from whistleblowers emerged, the national media began to take notice. Initially, coverage was sporadic and focused on individual incidents rather than systemic patterns. Journalists who spoke with anonymous sources described confusion, frustration, and concern among players. We started hearing consistent reports across teams, one reporter said. The subtlety of the issue made it difficult to verify at first, but the consistency was undeniable. Players were talking, quietly at first, but it was enough to prompt further investigation. The media's attention marked a shift in the scandal from internal awareness to public scrutiny, signaling that the revelations would no longer remain confined to locker rooms and team offices. The emotional weight of this transition was significant. Whistleblowers realized that their actions could now influence public perception, league policy, and the careers of those implicated. They were aware that once the information reached a broader audience, the narrative could become simplified or sensationalized. Yet they pressed forward, recognizing that the stakes player safety, integrity of the sport, and accountability were far greater than personal risk. Their courage provided the impetus for broader institutional and societal attention to the scandal. As national media coverage expanded, the league faced mounting pressure to respond decisively. Investigations were publicized, statements were issued, and internal audits were intensified. Whistleblowers continued to provide evidence and insight, reinforcing the narrative of deliberate tampering. Players began to feel that their concerns were being validated, yet the exposure also increased the scrutiny and potential backlash they could face. The emotional complexity of the moment was evident. Relief that wrongdoing was being acknowledged. Anxiety about personal consequences, and frustration that the disruption had been allowed to persist for so long. The stories of whistleblowers revealed another crucial dimension: the depth of planning and knowledge involved in the tampering. Insiders described modifications that targeted specific performance vulnerabilities, exploiting the physics of gloves, helmets, and pads. These were not random errors or manufacturing defects. They were intentional actions designed to subtly influence outcomes while minimizing detection. Whistleblowers provided both technical and experiential insight, allowing investigators to connect evidence across teams, players, and games. This information became the foundation for understanding the scope and sophistication of the scandal. Players reflected on the courage of those speaking out. A veteran linebacker noted, "It is hard to imagine doing what they did. You are risking everything, yet you are acting to protect others." That is the essence of integrity. And without it, nothing in this league would mean anything. The acknowledgement of whistleblowers. Bravery highlighted not only their personal sacrifice, but also the broader ethical framework that had been violated by tampering. Trust, once broken, would take years to rebuild. Yet these individuals set the first example of accountability and courage. The period in which whistleblowers came forward marked a turning point in the scandal. What began as isolated observations in locker rooms evolved into a coordinated effort to document, report, and expose systemic manipulation. The information provided by insiders, corroborated by laboratory analysis and statistical data, created a compelling narrative that no longer could be ignored. The league, the teams, and the public were confronted with evidence that the integrity of competition, player safety, and professional ethics had all been compromised. By the time the story reached national media attention, the implications were clear. The scandal was no longer hypothetical. Players' experiences, technical analysis, and eyewitness accounts converged to reveal deliberate interference with equipment, coordinated across multiple levels. Whistleblowers had transformed private concern into public accountability, catalyzing a chain of events that would reshape policies, procedures, and perceptions within the NFL. Their courage, persistence, and moral clarity illuminated the human dimension of the scandal and set the stage for a broader reckoning that would follow in subsequent investigations and disclosures. League regulations governing equipment specifications are explicit. Every helmet, pad, glove, and cleat must meet defined standards for safety and performance. Sports lawyers emphasize that the deliberate nature of the tampering made this far more serious. The act was not a negligent oversight or a manufacturing anomaly. It was a calculated manipulation intended to produce measurable performance effects while avoiding detection. Criminal liability, while rarely pursued in professional sports, emerged as a possibility in this context. Tampering with equipment to intentionally compromise safety could be construed as endangering athletes, potentially meeting the threshold for criminal negligence or assault under applicable state laws. Ethical considerations ran even deeper than the legal ones. Professional sports operate on a foundation of trust between players and teams, teams and leagues and the public. When that trust is violated, the moral injury can be as significant as the physical consequences. Over the course of a season, repeated exposure compounds the risk. Tampering directly undermined that responsibility, demonstrating a willful disregard for human safety. Wins and losses are no longer determined solely by skill, strategy, and athleticism. They are artificially influenced by deliberate interference. Tampering violates a social contract that extends far beyond the field, creating ripple effects that can undermine confidence in the league itself. Journalists chronicling the scandal emphasized the broader cultural impact. Professional football is more than a sport. It is a cultural institution, a symbol of effort, perseverance, and achievement. When complaints arose, they were initially dismissed or minimized. These lapses reflect not only technical failures, but ethical deficiencies. Leadership in professional sports carries an implicit moral obligation to protect those who risk their bodies in pursuit of the game, to ensure equitable conditions, and to uphold the integrity of competition. Tampering violated each of these principles. Ethical analysis also extends to the league itself. The NFL has long positioned itself as the guardian of player safety and fairness. The discovery of tampering raises questions about oversight, enforcement, and institutional accountability. How could subtle manipulations persist across multiple teams and seasons without detection? The answer lies partially in organizational complexity, but also in a culture that often prioritizes results over ethics. By examining the systemic vulnerabilities exposed by the scandal, ethicists argue that leagues must adopt proactive measures, stronger oversight, independent audits, and clear channels for reporting misconduct. Moral responsibility is not confined to individual actors. It extends to the systems that enable or fail to prevent wrongdoing. The scandal also prompted reflection on broader systemic issues. Sports lawyers, ethicists, and journalists collectively emphasized that tampering exposes vulnerabilities in oversight, culture, and incentive structures. When competitive advantage is valued over player welfare, ethical lapses become more likely. When organizational hierarchies discourage dissent, whistleblowers face additional pressure. When financial and reputational stakes are high, risk-taking may extend to morally dubious actions. The scandal illustrated how complex systems can enable wrongdoing, even in highly regulated professional environments, reinforcing the importance of both accountability and cultural change. Journalists highlighted the deliberate nature of tampering, the sophistication of modifications, and the human consequences for players. Commentary ranged from analysis of liability to critique of organizational culture. The exposure intensified pressure on the league to act decisively, to investigate thoroughly, and to impose meaningful consequences. Lawyers and ethicists alike emphasize that addressing these consequences requires both structural reform and cultural reckoning. Restoring integrity is not merely a matter of rules, it is a matter of moral repair. The analysis of legal and ethical implications sets the stage for subsequent chapters of the scandal. As the league moved from internal investigation to public exposure, media scrutiny escalated and systemic accountability became unavoidable. The combination of technical, legal, and ethical considerations framed the unfolding narrative. Understanding the legal and ethical dimensions is essential to grasp the full significance of the scandal, highlighting the intersection of human behavior, institutional responsibility, and the foundational principles of professional football. The moment the scandal reached the public, the world of professional football shifted in ways that no internal investigation could fully predict. For decades, fans had trusted the league, the teams, and the athletes to compete on a level playing field, to respect the rules, and to honor the integrity of the game. The news that equipment had been deliberately tampered with struck at the heart of that trust. Headlines proliferated across newspapers, websites, and broadcasts, each iteration framing the narrative in a mix of shock, outrage, and disbelief. Players, teams, and the league were suddenly exposed to scrutiny far beyond the locker room, forcing everyone involved to confront a reality they had long managed privately. Media coverage was swift and relentless. Investigative journalists, equipped with testimonies from whistleblowers and preliminary reports from the league's internal inquiry, began publishing detailed accounts of tampered gloves, helmets, and shoulder pads. Technical explanations were provided for lay audiences, describing how slight modifications could compromise grip, stability, and safety. Analysts charted patterns of performance decline and minor injuries that correlated with the affected equipment. Within days, the scandal became a national story, dominating sports sections and talk shows, while social media amplified the outrage. Fans debated the implications, expressing disappointment, anger, and confusion. The collective consciousness of football's audience had been challenged by revelations that the sport they loved was vulnerable to deliberate manipulation. Players were immediately thrust into the center of public attention. Quarterbacks who had struggled with unresponsive gloves, linemen whose pads had shifted during crucial plays, and receivers who had dropped passes all found their careers dissected by media narratives. Some were sympathetic figures, portrayed as victims of circumstances beyond their control. Others faced skepticism, with commentators questioning whether performance declines had other causes. The emotional toll on athletes was profound. They had always accepted that football demanded resilience and risk. But being caught in the middle of a scandal where their safety and competitive integrity had been compromised added layers of frustration, humiliation, and anxiety. One veteran lineman reflected, "You feel exposed, not just physically, but personally. Suddenly, everyone knows what was happening to you. And you have to reconcile the fear, the anger, and the embarrassment while still performing at your best." Teams, too, found themselves under intense scrutiny. Organizational decisions, oversight failures, and responses to initial complaints were analyzed in exhaustive detail. Social media platforms became forums for debate, with some fans expressing outrage at the league, while others focused on empathy for the players. Journalists noted the psychological dimension of fan reaction: anger at institutions, compassion for athletes, and anxiety about the legitimacy of future games. The league's public relations response sought to balance transparency with damage control. Statements were issued affirming the league's commitment to safety, integrity, and a thorough investigation. Officials emphasized cooperation with investigators, the implementation of new oversight procedures, and support for affected players. Yet the reality of tampering was far more complex. Behind carefully worded statements lay months of internal denial, delayed action, and resistance to whistleblowers. The discrepancy between public messaging and internal reality fueled skepticism among journalists and fans, raising questions about accountability and the authenticity of league leadership. The tension between narrative control and factual exposure created a fraught environment where trust had to be rebuilt while the scandal continued to unfold. Public exposure also intensified the personal consequences for whistleblowers. Those who had acted to reveal tampering suddenly found themselves recognized publicly, sometimes praised, sometimes vilified. Players and staff who had chosen anonymity faced challenges as reporters pieced together details, occasionally identifying them despite precautions. The emotional toll was considerable: relief that wrongdoing was being acknowledged, anxiety about personal and professional repercussions, and the weight of knowing that their courage had triggered a national reckoning. The social and professional risks they had taken were magnified by media attention. Yet their contributions were indispensable in ensuring that the full scope of tampering was understood. Legal and ethical analyses were increasingly covered in the public discourse. Lawyers provided commentary on potential civil and criminal liability for teams, suppliers, and executives. Ethicists discussed the moral dimensions, emphasizing the betrayal of trust, a compromise of player safety, and the systemic failures that enabled tampering. Journalists highlighted both individual accountability and institutional oversight. Together, these analyses framed the scandal as not merely a technical violation, but a profound ethical crisis, demanding both remedial action and broader reform. The public narrative became a convergence of emotion, legality, and moral philosophy, reflecting the multifaceted impact of deliberate equipment manipulation. The cultural consequences of public exposure were equally significant. Football had long symbolized meritocracy, toughness, and competition on a level playing field. The tampering scandal challenged these assumptions, revealing that even in a highly regulated environment, human and organizational actions could undermine fairness. Fans, players, and stakeholders were forced to reconsider what it meant to compete, to trust, and to value achievement. The league's response would not only be measured in penalties or policy changes, but in its ability to restore faith in the fundamental principles of the sport. The reputational stakes were enormous, extending far beyond the immediate season or the affected teams. Players described a complex mix of emotions as public attention intensified. Relief that their concerns were validated was tempered by embarrassment, anger, and the burden of scrutiny. Some struggled with feelings of vulnerability as previously private experiences became widely discussed. Others expressed pride in having contributed to exposing wrongdoing, emphasizing the importance of accountability over personal discomfort. A veteran receiver explained, "It is a strange combination of vindication and exposure. You feel justified, but also exposed. Everyone is watching, judging, and trying to understand what happened to you. The game you love suddenly feels fragile, like something you thought was solid can be shaken." This duality captured the human impact of public exposure in ways that transcended statistics or technical analysis. The league faced a difficult balancing act between controlling narrative and addressing reality. Public statements emphasized remedial measures. Yet internal investigations continued to uncover additional instances of tampering, extending the scope and complexity of the scandal. Teams were advised to cooperate fully, and compliance protocols were strengthened, yet the perception of initial negligence lingered. Fans and media maintained pressure, and the league's leadership recognized that transparency, honesty, and accountability were essential to restoring credibility. Every action, delay, or misstatement could exacerbate reputational damage, making the stakes exceptionally high. As public exposure unfolded, tension between accountability and secrecy became evident. Players, coaches, executives, and whistleblowers navigated a landscape in which disclosure carried both risk and responsibility. Fans demanded transparency. Journalists pursued verification, and the league sought to maintain authority while responding to emerging evidence. This tension reflected the broader challenge of professional sports, balancing competitive imperatives, organizational interests, and the ethical and moral obligations owed to players and the public. The exposure illuminated the fragility of trust, the weight of moral responsibility, and the necessity of systemic change. The scandal, now fully in the public eye, set the stage for the next phase: formal repercussions, policy reform, and long-term consequences for players, teams, and the league itself. Public scrutiny forced a reckoning that could not be deferred, highlighting the convergence of ethics, legality, and human impact. The revelations challenged assumptions about fairness, safety, and oversight, while reaffirming the courage of those who had risked careers to expose wrongdoing. The unfolding narrative demonstrated that transparency, though difficult and often uncomfortable, was indispensable for restoring integrity and safeguarding the human dimension of the sport. The revelation of equipment tampering sent shockwaves through the NFL, triggering a cascade of consequences that extended far beyond the initial incidents. Teams were confronted with accountability for lapses in oversight, management failures, and complicity, whether deliberate or negligent, in allowing tampering to persist. Executives who had once been shielded by layers of bureaucracy suddenly faced intense scrutiny from league officials, media, and fans alike. Front offices were forced to review internal protocols, investigate their own compliance departments, and confront uncomfortable questions about the culture that had permitted these violations to occur. For some organizations, the fallout was immediate and severe, resulting in suspensions, resignations, or restructuring of key personnel. Staff members who had direct responsibility for equipment maintenance faced both professional and personal consequences. Equipment managers, assistants, and even trainers who had overlooked anomalies or failed to escalate concerns found themselves under investigation. In some cases, individuals who had acted as whistleblowers were vindicated, their courage highlighted in league statements, media coverage, and internal reviews. Others, however, suffered career repercussions simply for being associated with teams where tampering occurred, illustrating the collateral damage that accompanies systemic failures. The human cost of accountability was clear. Individuals at every level were forced to reconcile their professional roles with ethical and legal responsibilities, while navigating a highly publicized and emotionally charged environment. Equipment manufacturers also became focal points in the aftermath. Companies supplying helmets, pads, gloves, and other protective gear were compelled to demonstrate compliance with league standards, provide transparent documentation of manufacturing processes, and participate in investigations. Audits of production lines revealed that some modifications had been applied post-manufacture, sometimes by intermediaries or third-party contractors. Legal teams and league officials worked together to determine liability, evaluate contractual obligations, and assess whether manufacturer negligence or complicity had contributed to the crisis. Manufacturers faced reputational consequences, lawsuits, and in some instances, mandatory revisions to both products and quality assurance protocols. One of the most significant outcomes of the scandal was the sweeping reform of league policies and equipment standards. The NFL implemented stricter regulations governing inspection, maintenance, and certification of all gear, establishing independent oversight to verify compliance. Mandatory training for equipment staff emphasized both technical precision and ethical responsibility, while whistleblower protection policies were strengthened to encourage reporting of anomalies without fear of retaliation. Laboratory testing became more rigorous, with random audits conducted to detect tampering or deviations from approved specifications. These reforms were designed not only to prevent future incidents, but also to restore confidence among players, teams, and fans that the league was actively safeguarding the integrity of the sport. The league also initiated educational programs to ensure that athletes understood both their rights and the standards of equipment safety. Players were given access to detailed explanations of equipment mechanics, the potential risks of tampering, and the procedures for reporting concerns. By integrating transparency into player education, the NFL sought to rebuild trust that had been eroded by the scandal. Interviews with athletes revealed mixed emotions: relief that measures were in place to prevent further tampering, appreciation for increased involvement in equipment oversight, but lingering skepticism that systemic issues had been fully addressed. The reforms represented progress, yet they could not erase the memory of the vulnerabilities that had persisted unchecked for years. Justice for affected players was complex and multifaceted. Some athletes received formal apologies, financial restitution, or medical support to address injuries linked to altered equipment. Others expressed frustration that consequences did not adequately reflect the risk they had endured or the impact on their careers. Retrospective analyses revealed that performance declines, missed opportunities, and long-term health effects could not always be remedied through policy changes alone. The league faced criticism for delayed acknowledgement, inconsistent penalties, and the difficulty of translating reforms into immediate reparations for those harmed. The pursuit of justice, therefore, was ongoing. encompassing both tangible outcomes and the moral imperative to acknowledge wrongdoing and prevent recurrence. Emotional commentary from players, staff, and journalists reflected the lingering tension between progress and unresolved questions. A veteran quarterback noted, "The reforms are necessary, and they are a start, but you can never forget the betrayal." Equipment managers emphasized that the scandal had forced a reevaluation of both procedures and culture, highlighting the importance of proactive responsibility rather than reactive crisis management. Ethicists underscored that trust, once broken, requires sustained effort to repair, involving transparency, accountability, and genuine acknowledgement of harm. The emotional dimension of reform, therefore, was as critical as the technical and legal measures put in place. Fans, too, experienced a profound emotional journey. Loyalty to teams and admiration for players had been challenged by revelations of deliberate manipulation. Some expressed anger at the league, while others focused on empathy for athletes who had unknowingly played with compromised gear. Social media and fan forums were filled with debate, reflection, and discussion of the broader implications for fairness and competition. Public sentiment emphasized that trust extends beyond technical compliance. It encompasses confidence in leadership, commitment to safety, and the ethical stewardship of the sport. Rebuilding that trust required sustained effort, as fans evaluated both the efficacy of reforms and the authenticity of league accountability. The systemic nature of the scandal prompted reflection on the broader culture of professional football. Analysts and commentators emphasized that competitive pressures, organizational hierarchies, and incentives to win at all costs had created an environment where tampering could occur. Internal reporting mechanisms were insufficient, oversight was uneven, and ethical considerations were sometimes subordinated to short-term advantage. The reforms implemented in the aftermath addressed immediate technical vulnerabilities, yet they could not fully alter ingrained cultural dynamics. Observers highlighted the importance of ongoing cultural change, including leadership modeling, ethical behavior, incentivizing transparency, and promoting open communication at all organizational levels. The scandal also exposed vulnerabilities in accountability mechanisms. While policy reforms strengthened compliance and oversight, questions remained about enforcement, consistency, and the capacity to detect subtle manipulations in real time. Independent audits, laboratory testing, and whistleblower protections were critical. Yet the effectiveness of these measures depends on sustained vigilance and organizational commitment. Even after reforms, lingering doubts persisted about whether all vulnerabilities had been addressed and whether future tampering could occur. The emotional weight of uncertainty underscored that recovery from scandal is not merely procedural. It involves rebuilding trust, repairing relationships, and acknowledging the human cost of institutional failure. In parallel, journalists and commentators evaluated whether justice had truly been served. The period of fallout and reform also reinforced the importance of whistleblowers. Their courage had initiated the chain of events that led to accountability, media exposure, and policy change. Athletes and staff recognized that meaningful reform depends on individuals willing to confront wrongdoing despite personal risk. Whistleblowers, once marginalized, were now celebrated as catalysts for positive change, demonstrating the transformative power of individual action within complex systems. Ultimately, the fallout and reform phase underscored the interconnection of ethics, legality, culture, and human experience. Structural changes, enhanced oversight, and updated policies were critical, yet they could not fully erase the memory of compromise, vulnerability, and betrayal. The emotional and psychological dimensions of trust, accountability, and integrity became inseparable from technical compliance. Players, staff, executives, and fans alike had to navigate a transformed landscape where confidence in the system required both evidence of reform and reassurance that moral obligations would continue to guide decision-making. The narrative of fallout and reform left unresolved questions that would continue to influence the league and its culture. While policies had been strengthened and accountability mechanisms implemented, systemic vulnerabilities remained under scrutiny. Observers emphasized that enduring change requires sustained attention, ongoing cultural reinforcement, and vigilance against complacency. The scandal served as a cautionary tale, illustrating that competitive pressures, human ambition, and organizational complexity can create conditions where ethical and technical failures intersect. The reforms were meaningful, but the work of maintaining integrity and trust was ongoing, demanding constant commitment from every level of the sport. The most profound and often overlooked aspect of the equipment tampering scandal is the human cost. While legal disputes, policy reforms, and media coverage dominate headlines, the physical, emotional, and psychological toll on players remains at the center of this story. Professional football is a sport of calculated risk, where athletes accept the possibility of injury as part of their vocation. Yet, when the tools designed to protect them are compromised, the risks are amplified in ways that are deliberate, insidious, and deeply personal. The scandal exposed how fragile the balance between performance, protection, and trust can be, and how quickly a career, or even a life, can be altered when that balance is disrupted. Players immediately recognized that altered helmets, pads, and gloves were not simply inconvenient, they were dangerous. Small changes in padding density, strap tension, or glove grip might seem minor on paper, but in practice, they magnified vulnerability to injury. Linebackers reported unusual strain in their shoulders, and receivers experienced drops or awkward catches that contributed to concussions or joint injuries. A veteran defensive end described the disorienting feeling of stepping onto the field, knowing that even familiar gear could betray him. The physical consequences extended beyond individual plays. Repeated microtraumas, compounded by compromised equipment, resulted in chronic injuries, prolonged recovery periods, and long-term medical concerns that would shadow players long after retirement. Mental and emotional impacts were equally pervasive. Players wrestled with fear, frustration, and a profound sense of betrayal. Trust in teammates, coaches, and management eroded when it became clear that someone within the organization had compromised their safety. Anxiety and hypervigilance became routine as athletes scrutinized equipment before every practice, every game, aware that even the smallest deviation could carry serious consequences. A quarterback reflected, "You start looking at everything differently. Every snap, every pad, every glove. It's not paranoia, it's survival. And it weighs on you mentally because your career, your health, your life depend on it." The psychological burden was compounded by the public scrutiny and media attention, amplifying stress and leaving lasting emotional scars. The careers of many players were irreversibly altered. Performance declines that coincided with tampered equipment affected contracts, draft evaluations, and endorsements. Some athletes experienced abrupt drops in productivity or were sidelined by injuries that might have been avoided under proper conditions. The timing of these incidents could not be ignored. A critical playoff game, a high-stakes contract negotiation, or a contract year could be defined by the subtle effects of compromised gear. Players lost opportunities for career advancement, financial security, and professional recognition. Consequences that extended far beyond the immediate injury. Retrospective analysis revealed that even minor performance decrements can have disproportionate effects on professional trajectories, emphasizing the high stakes of equipment integrity. Long-term physical consequences were equally significant. Medical evaluations of affected players revealed lingering joint instability, recurrent concussions, and chronic pain associated with years of compromised protection. Doctors emphasize that repetitive injuries, even minor ones, accumulate over time, producing conditions such as arthritis, neuropathy, and cognitive impairments. Players reported persistent soreness, reduced mobility, and heightened susceptibility to re-injury. The knowledge that these outcomes were linked to deliberate tampering intensified feelings of injustice. As athletes understood that their health had been compromised, not by chance, but by intentional human intervention. The ethical weight of this realization added a unique psychological burden to the physical damage. The scandal also exposed the emotional labor involved in reconciling personal ambition with systemic betrayal. Athletes dedicate years, often decades, to honing skills, building endurance, and cultivating resilience. To invest so much effort only to discover that deliberate interference compromised safety and performance was profoundly disheartening. Some players describe feelings of helplessness as the very organizations that should have safeguarded their careers were implicated in violations. A rookie linebacker explained, "You come in with trust and belief in the system, and it feels like that foundation was ripped out from under you. Every decision, every play, every hit feels tainted, because you know someone manipulated the tools you rely on to survive out there." The emotional impact of betrayal was inseparable from the physical realities, underscoring the holistic human cost of the scandal. Family members and personal support networks were also affected. Athletes' loved ones often bear witness to injuries, emotional strain, and career uncertainty. Parents, spouses, and children experienced anxiety and fear as they observed compromised performance and heightened risk. The scandal disrupted the private lives of players, creating tension, stress, and emotional strain within households. Interviews with families revealed that the scandal's consequences extended far beyond the stadium, affecting interpersonal relationships and long-term well-being. The human dimension of accountability, therefore, encompasses not only players themselves, but the networks that sustain them through the highs and lows of professional sport. The psychological dimension included not only stress and fear, but also grief over lost opportunities. Players who might have reached Pro Bowl selections, career milestones, or championship success found those paths altered by circumstances beyond their control. Emotional reflection on these losses was common. Athletes described a lingering sense of injustice, not simply for their individual careers, but for the integrity of the game itself. Veteran players noted that their passion for football had been tainted by disillusionment, recognizing that trust and fairness, once violated, are difficult to restore. The scandal revealed how deeply professional identity is intertwined with ethical and organizational fidelity, and how breaches in trust can reshape an athlete's sense of self. In many cases, players turn to advocacy and storytelling as a means of coping. Speaking publicly, testifying before oversight bodies, or participating in media coverage provided opportunities to reclaim agency and assert moral authority. Athletes emphasize the importance of exposing wrongdoing, protecting future generations, and promoting systemic reform. These testimonies offered both catharsis and accountability, contributing to a broader understanding of the scandal's impact. The act of sharing their experiences underscored, the resilience and moral courage of individuals confronting profound personal and professional challenges. The scandal also highlighted disparities in how athletes experience consequences. Younger players, often less familiar with organizational politics, are more vulnerable to both physical harm and psychological distress. Veterans, while aware of risks, face difficult choices about speaking out versus preserving relationships, contracts, and future opportunities. Testimonies reflected the complex calculus of professional survival in an environment where ethical lapses intersect with career imperatives. These dynamics emphasized that the human cost is not uniform but shaped by individual circumstances, power structures, and systemic inequalities. Emotional reflections from those affected underscored enduring psychological consequences. Depression, anxiety, and lingering mistrust were common themes. Players described difficulty returning to pre-scandal levels of confidence, both in equipment and in organizational leadership. The mental burden often persisted long after reforms, compensation, or policy changes. One former offensive lineman said, "Even when the league tried to make it right, the memory stays with you. You always double-check, always wonder if something could go wrong. The trust is fractured, and it is not something that can be fixed with paperwork or rules." The testimonial nature of these reflections reveals that the human cost encompasses both tangible and intangible consequences, emphasizing the depth of the scandal's impact. The lasting effects also extend into health management and retirement planning. Players who endured injuries linked to tampered equipment often required ongoing medical care, surgeries, and long-term treatment. Financial consequences emerged as well, with some athletes confronting reduced earning potential due to diminished performance or shortened careers. The intersection of physical harm, emotional stress, and economic repercussions illustrates the multidimensional nature of human cost. The scandal demonstrated that professional sports, while glamorous and high-profile, involve profound personal vulnerability that can be exploited when ethical boundaries are crossed. The cumulative human cost is a narrative of sacrifice, betrayal, and resilience. Athletes gave their bodies, time, and trust to a system that, at its worst, failed them. The scandal forced players to navigate injury, emotional trauma, and public scrutiny simultaneously. The experiences shared by players, their families, and their support networks provide a sobering perspective on the consequences of organizational misconduct. These personal stories are not ancillary to the scandal. They are central to understanding the stakes and the enduring impact on human lives. As Batch 9 concludes, the focus on human cost emphasizes both immediate and long-term consequences. Careers were altered, bodies compromised, and emotional trust fractured. Yet players' testimonies also highlight resilience, moral courage, and advocacy for systemic reform. Their experiences serve as a reminder that professional sports are not merely contests of skill and strategy, but human endeavors, in which ethical breaches resonate far beyond the scoreboard. The scandal's enduring human cost frames the context for the final reflection on legacy, lessons learned, and the broader implications for the NFL. As the final chapters of the equipment tampering scandal unfolded, the magnitude of systemic failure became undeniable. The events exposed weaknesses at every level of professional football. From organizational hierarchies to equipment oversight, from individual ethics to league-wide accountability. What began as seemingly isolated incidents of modified helmets, gloves, and pads evolved into a narrative about the fragility of trust, the complexity of oversight, and the high stakes of professional sport. Players, coaches, executives, and fans alike were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. That systems designed to protect them had failed, that oversight mechanisms were inadequate, and that ethical lapses could ripple through careers, institutions, and the culture of the game itself. Reflecting on the scandal, the central lesson is the enduring importance of integrity. Trust, once fractured, is exceptionally difficult to restore. Players invest not only physical labor, but emotional commitment into the sport, assuming that the rules of engagement and the tools they use to compete are reliable and safe. The deliberate manipulation of equipment violated that trust, introducing vulnerability where confidence had long been implicit. The scandal demonstrates that ethical responsibility is not ancillary to the sport, it is foundational. When integrity is compromised, the human cost is immediate and far-reaching. This is not only a lesson for the NFL, but a cautionary tale for all competitive institutions where ambition, pressure, and human error intersect. League accountability, or the lack thereof, was another stark lesson. For years, complaints and anomalies were raised internally but failed to provoke decisive action. Reports were delayed, concerns minimized, and whistleblowers marginalized. The organizational culture in which short-term performance often outweighed long-term safety and ethical responsibility allowed tampering to persist. Once the scandal became public, the NFL faced immense pressure to enforce consequences and implement reforms. The resulting policy changes increased oversight, and transparency initiatives were essential. Yet they could not retroactively erase the harm inflicted. Accountability is not merely punitive. It requires acknowledgement of systemic failure, a commitment to correction, and continuous vigilance to prevent recurrence. Players' experiences during the scandal revealed the deep interconnection between ethical leadership and performance. Trust in equipment, teammates, and organizational decisions underpins confidence on the field. When that trust is compromised, athletes face psychological stress that can manifest as hesitation, self-doubt, and diminished effectiveness. The scandal illustrated that ethical breaches have tangible consequences beyond abstract morality. They directly impact careers, health, and the ability to compete. Athletes' testimonies highlight the necessity of embedding integrity into every layer of the sport, emphasizing that ethical responsibility is inseparable from the practical operation of a professional league. The scandal reshaped the relationship between players and the league. Athletes who had previously relied on institutional systems for safety and guidance found themselves navigating a landscape in which trust had been broken. While reforms provided structural assurances, the emotional and psychological ramifications of betrayal lingered. Players emphasized that accountability must be both procedural and cultural, reflecting the reality that policy alone cannot restore confidence. The scandal prompted an ongoing dialogue between athletes and leadership, redefining expectations for transparency, communication, and ethical governance. In this sense, the legacy extends beyond policy. It fundamentally altered the social contract between players and the institutions that govern them. Integrity, as a guiding principle, emerged as a recurrent theme throughout the aftermath. The scandal demonstrated that rules, regulations, and oversight are insufficient if they are not embedded in a culture that prioritizes moral responsibility. Ethical lapses, once tolerated or ignored, can create cascading effects that compromise safety, erode trust, and damage institutional credibility. Interviews with coaches and executives revealed a recognition that culture matters as much as compliance. Promoting ethical behavior, supporting whistleblowers, and emphasizing the welfare of athletes are critical to sustaining both competitive performance and public confidence. The scandal underscores that integrity is an active, ongoing commitment rather than a passive expectation. One of the lasting lessons involves the interplay between transparency and accountability. Once media exposure brought the scandal to light, the public response became a force that demanded corrective action. Transparency through public disclosure, investigative reporting, and open acknowledgement of wrongdoing was instrumental in driving reform. Yet transparency alone is insufficient without substantive action. The scandal revealed that accountability must be proactive, structured, and enforced consistently. Organizational culture, leadership ethics, and policy frameworks must work in concert to ensure that trust is maintained and that misconduct cannot persist unnoticed. The legacy of the scandal also includes recognition of the courage required to expose wrongdoing. Whistleblowers, players, and staff who spoke out risked careers, reputations, and personal relationships. Their actions were pivotal in uncovering tampering, holding institutions accountable, and prompting systemic reform. Their experiences demonstrate that ethical responsibility is not only a matter of policy, but also of individual moral courage. The lessons extend beyond organizational boundaries, emphasizing that the willingness to act in the face of personal risk is often the catalyst for meaningful change. The scandal prompted reflection on how competitive pressures intersect with ethical decision-making. Professional football exists in an environment of high stakes, where victory is paramount, careers are short, and organizational success is measured in wins, profits, and reputation. These pressures can distort judgment, creating incentives to prioritize performance over integrity. The equipment tampering scandal exemplifies how ethical compromises can arise from these dynamics, highlighting the necessity of robust oversight, ethical training, and cultural reinforcement. Lessons learned underscore that safeguarding integrity requires deliberate, ongoing effort to align incentives, enforce rules, and cultivate an environment where ethical considerations are paramount. Another enduring consequence is the recognition of the human dimension in systemic failures. The scandal is not solely about equipment, policy, or competitive advantage. It is about individuals whose careers, health, and lives were affected. The human stories, the athletes whose bodies were compromised, whose trust was betrayed, and whose careers were disrupted, remain central to understanding the full scope of impact. Their experiences provide a lens through which systemic failures can be examined, ensuring that reforms address both technical compliance and the ethical obligations owed to those who dedicate their lives to the sport. The narrative of lessons and legacy also emphasizes vigilance. Systems designed to prevent misconduct are only as effective as the commitment of individuals who operate within them. The scandal illustrated that oversight, policy, and compliance measures require constant reinforcement. Players, staff, and executives must remain alert, proactive, and empowered to identify and report anomalies. Ongoing education, transparent communication, and cultural emphasis on ethical responsibility are critical to sustaining reforms. The NFL's experience underscores that safeguarding integrity is not a one-time effort, but a continuous process requiring attention, resources, and accountability at every level. Looking back, the scandal serves as a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities of professional sports as a human enterprise. While technical regulations, equipment standards, and oversight mechanisms are essential, they are insufficient if ethical culture is weak or neglected. The interplay between trust, responsibility, and accountability emerges as a central theme, demonstrating that systemic integrity is multidimensional, encompassing human judgment, organizational culture, and policy enforcement. These lessons extend beyond football, providing a framework for understanding the consequences of ethical lapses in any competitive or institutional context. Finally, the scandal leaves a legacy that continues to resonate. It reshaped expectations for league conduct, informed reforms that protect athletes, and highlighted the importance of moral courage in exposing wrongdoing. Yet it also reminds us of the fragility of trust, the stakes of ethical compromise, and the enduring responsibility of institutions to prioritize the welfare of those they serve. Players, executives, and fans are now united by a shared awareness that the integrity of sport is not inherent. It must be actively cultivated, maintained, and defended. The lessons are clear, the legacy profound, and the responsibility ongoing. As this documentary draws to a close, the lingering resonance of the equipment tampering scandal becomes impossible to ignore. The story we have followed is not merely about altered helmets, compromised pads, or manipulated gloves. It is about the human beings at the center of the sport, the players who dedicate their bodies, their time, and their trust to a league that, in this instance, failed them in ways both profound and lasting. It is about the invisible costs of ethical compromise, the erosion of trust, and the complexities inherent in institutions designed to both entertain and protect. To understand the full impact, one must consider not only the facts, the reforms, and the policies, but also the emotional, psychological, and cultural dimensions that ripple far beyond the stadium. The human cost remains the most striking aspect of the scandal. We have heard the stories of athletes whose careers were disrupted, whose bodies were compromised, and whose trust in teammates, coaches, and management was fractured. Injuries that might have been preventable became defining moments, altering performance, contract negotiations, and personal trajectories. The emotional toll, often invisible to the public, manifested in anxiety, doubt, and a pervasive sense of betrayal. Players describe the psychological burden of stepping onto the field, unsure whether their own protective gear could be trusted. Confidence, once instinctive, became calculated. The very act of playing was transformed from a demonstration of skill and courage into a navigation of risk, uncertainty, and suspicion. Yet the scandal also underscores the courage and resilience of those affected. Whistleblowers, players, and staff who spoke out did so despite personal and professional risk. Their actions catalyzed investigations, prompted reform, and restored a measure of accountability to the sport. These individuals illuminate a critical dimension of professional football, often overlooked. That ethical courage, moral responsibility, and the willingness to act in the face of danger are as essential to the game's integrity as talent strategy and physical prowess. Their choices, often fraught with uncertainty, shaped the trajectory of the scandal and established a precedent for the moral and institutional vigilance required to protect athletes in the future. The league's response, while substantial in some respects, revealed both the capacity and the limitations of organizational accountability. Reforms were implemented: stricter equipment, inspections, independent oversight, updated policies, and protections for whistleblowers. These changes signaled recognition of the failures and a commitment to preventing recurrence. Yet the emotional and cultural consequences of the scandal could not be erased by policy alone. Athletes, staff, and fans alike continue to grapple with questions of trust, fairness, and ethical responsibility. The narrative demonstrates that institutional reforms, while necessary, are insufficient without sustained cultural reinforcement, consistent enforcement, and an organizational commitment to integrity that transcends written regulations. Reflecting on ethical lessons, the scandal offers a stark reminder that competitive ambition and organizational success can never justify compromising human welfare. The deliberate manipulation of equipment in pursuit of performance or advantage exemplifies the danger of prioritizing victory over ethics. It is a cautionary tale that resonates beyond football. Wherever ambition and oversight intersect, ethical vigilance is essential. The human body, the foundation of performance, cannot be treated as a tool to be exploited. The scandal forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the compromises organizations and individuals may make under pressure and the devastating consequences when moral boundaries are crossed. Cultural impact is equally significant. The scandal altered public perception, not only of teams and executives, but also of the league itself. Fans who had once assumed that the sport's integrity was inviolable were confronted with evidence of systemic failure. Questions about fairness, trust, and accountability emerged in public discourse, influencing how the sport is consumed, understood, and evaluated. Media coverage amplified these discussions, highlighting both the scandal and the broader societal expectations placed on professional sports organizations. The cultural ripple effect extended beyond the stadium, shaping conversations about ethics, transparency, and institutional responsibility in competitive environments at large. The narrative also reveals the fragility of trust. Players enter the league with confidence in the reliability of their equipment, their teammates, and the oversight mechanisms designed to protect them. That trust, once violated, is difficult to fully restore. The scandal illustrates how easily ethical breaches can erode confidence, transforming the very fabric of professional engagement. It underscores that trust is not abstract. It is operational, lived, and integral to performance. Every snap, every tackle, Every play relies on the implicit assurance that 1S gear and 1S environment are safe and fair. When that assurance is compromised, the consequences are immediate, personal, and enduring. The personal narratives throughout this documentary emphasize the dual nature of the scandal, both systemic and intimate. Players' testimonies revealed how organizational failure directly intersects with human experience. Injuries, performance declines, psychological stress, and career disruptions are tangible outcomes. Yet they are inseparable from the feelings of betrayal, vulnerability, and uncertainty that accompanied them. The scandal reminds us that institutional misconduct is not abstract. It manifests in human bodies, minds, and lives. Understanding the full scope of the story requires attention to both the macro-level consequences and the individual experiences that give those consequences meaning. Ethical responsibility emerges as a central theme, highlighting that accountability is not solely a matter of rules or policy, but of culture, leadership, and moral courage. Organizations must cultivate environments in which ethical behavior is expected, rewarded, and enforced. Employees and athletes must be empowered to report concerns without fear of retaliation. Leaders must model integrity, demonstrate transparency, and prioritize welfare over short-term gain. The scandal demonstrates that failures in these areas are costly, not only in legal or financial terms, but in the enduring human consequences that define careers, health, and trust. Another enduring lesson is the necessity of vigilance. Oversight mechanisms, technical standards, and policy frameworks are vital. Yet they are only effective when consistently applied, monitored, and reinforced. The equipment tampering scandal illustrates that even sophisticated systems can fail if human judgment, ethical awareness, and proactive intervention are absent. Continuous scrutiny, rigorous training, and independent verification are essential to maintaining integrity. The scandal provides a roadmap for prevention, integrating technical precision, ethical responsibility, and cultural reinforcement into every aspect of operations. The legacy of the scandal also involves reflection on the broader values of sport. Football is celebrated not only for skill, strategy, and competition, but also for trust, fairness, and the shared understanding that athletes operate under agreed-upon rules. Tampering undermines these foundational principles, challenging both participants and observers to reassess their assumptions about the sport. The scandal reinforced the idea that the meaning of professional football extends beyond the scoreboard. It encompasses ethical stewardship, institutional responsibility, and a commitment to safeguarding those who dedicate themselves to the game. Ultimately, the scandal demonstrates the interdependence of systems, individuals, and culture. Policies alone cannot prevent ethical breaches without engaged leadership, empowered participants, and a culture that prioritizes human welfare. Players cannot rely solely on oversight mechanisms. Their safety depends on the vigilance and moral compass of every individual within the organization. This interconnectedness highlights the complexity of professional sports as a human enterprise, in which ambition, competition, and institutional authority must be balanced against ethical responsibility, trust, and the fundamental value of human life. The emotional resonance of the scandal remains profound. Athletes, families, and fans carry memories, reflections, and lessons that extend far beyond the technical details. The courage of whistleblowers, the resilience of players, and the dedication of those who sought reform are central to the narrative. The scandal illustrates the stakes of ethical failure, the price of compromised trust, and the importance of sustained vigilance. These human stories provide the emotional and moral context for understanding the full impact of the events, reminding us that professional sport, for all its spectacle, is ultimately a human endeavor. In conclusion, the lessons and legacy of the equipment tampering scandal are both cautionary and instructive. The story exposes systemic weaknesses, ethical lapses, and cultural vulnerabilities. Yet it also highlights resilience, courage, and the capacity for reform. Players endured physical harm, emotional trauma, and career disruption. Teams and executives confronted accountability and implemented reforms. The league confronted the fragility of trust and the necessity of ethical stewardship. Fans and observers were forced to reassess their assumptions about the game they love. Together, these elements constitute a profound narrative about the responsibilities, risks, and moral imperatives inherent in professional sports. As we reflect on this scandal, unresolved tensions remain. Can institutional reforms truly prevent recurrence? Will cultural change endure alongside policy enforcement? How will future athletes navigate an environment shaped by both human ambition and systemic safeguards? These questions persist, emphasizing that the story is not confined to history, but continues to influence decisions, relationships, and ethical expectations in the present. The documentary concludes with an acknowledgement of the ongoing responsibility borne by every participant in the league, and by the institutions that govern it, to maintain integrity, uphold trust, and prioritize human welfare above all else. The scandal, its fallout, and its reforms leave an indelible mark on the NFL. It reminds us that the human cost of ethical failure is tangible, that systemic weaknesses must be actively addressed, and that the lessons of betrayal, resilience, and accountability are enduring. As we close this exploration, the final reflection is clear. Professional sports are not only contests of skill and strategy, they are ethical endeavors. The choices of individuals and institutions reverberate far beyond the field, shaping careers, health, and public trust. The equipment tampering scandal stands as both a warning and a lesson, an enduring testament to the necessity of integrity in all aspects of the game.